Before we get started with this episode, we need to call out a trigger warning. This episode is about child sexual abuse and covers subjects which might be seriously distressing for some listeners, including mention of suicide, sexual assault, child sexual abuse material, and torture. Please use your discretion. And if you are in need of any support or help, please contact one of your country's sexual abuse support organisations. They are there for you. Now, welcome to our 100th episode, which we are dedicating to the work of the phenomenal Michael Sheath. We had a really important conversation with Michael that, amongst other things, highlighted the need to call out the relationship between online pornography and sexual offending. Serious stuff from a man whose life has been dedicated to a very serious job. Since 1987, Michael has been dedicated to working with child sexual abuse offenders, beginning his journey as a probation officer and later becoming the Principal Practitioner at the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, a charity devoted to preventing child sexual abuse. His critically acclaimed work with male survivors of sexual abuse at HMP Blakenhurst earned him the prestigious Butler Trust Award in 1997. Michael's passion for understanding people's stories has resulted in a powerful and significant book, a collection of 5 theatrical monologues that delves into the human impacts of child sexual abuse, trauma, and the often overlooked effects on secondary victims like the families of offenders. All of these narratives are told from the perspective of those directly affected. Michael's own story is pretty compelling, so join us to hear from him about his impactful work and a profound conversation that shines a light on this ever-impactful issue.
So, I came across you after reading an article in The Guardian, and I found your history and approach fascinating. And I wondered, where did this all begin for you, Michael?
I was a university graduate with no idea what to do. So I joined a thing in the UK called Community Service Volunteers, and they just send you somewhere. So they sent me to a probation hostel, and I arrived there 21, very young, a very young 21, very naive and not really worldly. And there were 21 men in the probation hostel, some of whom had been convicted of murder, manslaughter, rape, general mayhem. They were sort of they were seen as recidivists. They used to say that phrase, and criminal lunatics. That was another phrase they used to say. So I was there on a kind of night shift, and I was absolutely terrified, but fascinated by the stories, the histories, the lives they'd led, and so forth. And weirdly, I can remember all of them. It was 1983. I can remember all of their names, and I can't remember the names of people I met yesterday. So it was a very powerful experience. And once you're there, people say, well, why don't you join the probation service? And I thought, why not? So I eventually joined the probation service, and then I qualified. And then I worked as a probation officer for just under 10 years. I did about 14 in the service, but qualified just under 10. I worked in the community and in prison, and whilst I was training, by just a peculiar fluke, I was placed in a probation office that was the only office in the UK that worked with sexual offenders in a group work setting. So I was a student, and they said, oh, you can join in with the group work. So I just turned up, and there were a group of men, all of whom had been convicted of child molestation, sex offences against children. And I just thought it was interesting and terrifying and just fascinating, again, their stories and their thinking. And I arrived at my office qualified and said, oh, I can run groups for that kind of person. And I was, again, naive enough to think that would be a good idea. So I ran groups with colleagues for sexual offenders. I went to prison, worked in a prison for 2 years, ran groups there for sexual offenders, and also ran a group for survivors who were all men, who were all prisoners. So it was kind of coming at it from the other end. None of them, as far as we knew, had sexual convictions. They were all pretty violent. They were all very damaged. They were all very kind of vengeful. And we worked with them in a rather sort of hippie-esque way, with candles and bells and transitional objects and storytelling and painting and so on. and I did the service for 10 years. And then I joined an organisation, it's an NGO here called the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, which was, again, at that time, the only NGO working sort of meaningfully, comprehensively with child molesters, convicted and unconvicted, which was a new one for me. You know, we had men who'd had allegations made against them, no findings, no convictions, but concerns. We worked with a lot of priests, mostly Catholic, mostly Irish, but other ministers, Methodists, Church of England, an imam, and so forth. A lot of family men, a lot of men who've been to prison and come out again. And from there, I mainly worked in what we call the family courts. You have family courts. I worked in family courts, and I did 25 and a half years. And the last half year was hell, because I decided to leave, and suddenly you're leaving and you just can't stand it anymore. But I worked in family courts with men and women who'd been convicted of offences against children, or had been alleged to have committed offences against children, or were in a partnership relationship, usually a marriage, with someone who had been convicted of or accused of sexual offences against children. So I worked with a huge number of men and a huge number of women. The men were mostly suspects or convicted. The women were mostly partners. And the job was, is this man dangerous? Is this woman able to protect? Or vice versa. And eventually I was the manager of what we call the assessment team. And I probably managed about 12 people, allocated work to them. And so I was in and out of the family courts, in the witness box, in what we call county court and high court, where the judge was trying to make a decision about, should this man return home? Should this man be removed from the home? Should this woman have her children removed from her? Should they be returned to her? And so on. So it was the real murky end of family law, because a lot of the time you didn't have any convictions, you just had allegations, sometimes findings, but it was the very grey area around risk and how you delineate that and how you balance risks and harms and so forth. And in addition to all that, I was delivering training to social workers, educational people, and police officers. And this is probably where this kicks in. In about 98, I began to engage with men who'd been convicted of downloading child sexual abuse material. Having spent from 1987 working with men who had, all of whom almost had engaged in direct molestation of children. So we had these what we call contact offenders. I dealt with a huge number of contact offenders, and then gradually began dealing with downloaders, online offenders, and then over time the proportion shifted till it became 50-50. So half of the men I was working with were downloaders or engaged children online. We call them solicitors or online groomers. And also dealing with their partners and dealing with the revelation, which is horrific for a woman, when early in the morning there's a knock on the door and it's 3 or 4 police officers, sometimes in uniform, nowadays usually not, saying, "Good morning, madam, is your husband in? I'm detective this and that, and here's my colleagues. We'd like to come in and discuss this warrant. Someone in this household has been downloading child abuse material. Good morning." And for women, the horror of that, because almost all of them have no idea what's been going on, and dealing with men who one moment have been looking at child abuse material and the next moment are in handcuffs and looking at jail, loss of reputation, suicide, shame, etc. So that population really interested me, both the men and the women, and their, again, stories. I'm very interested in people's stories, storytelling in a way, how this happened, how they feel about it. and so on. And I became interested in, the direction of travel of men who've been looking at child abuse material, where they started, where they ended up, how they felt about that, where they thought they were going, where the forensics said they were going, what they said they'd looked at versus what the forensics said they'd looked at, which was sometimes the same, sometimes very different, and about coming to terms with this population. And to cut a very long story short, some of them were nothing like the men I'd been dealing with who were contact offenders, and some of them were just like the men I'd been dealing with who were contact offenders, even though amongst that population you have an enormous diversity anyway. They're a very diverse population. You can't just say, "Ooh, child molesters are all like this." You can't say that. Nor can you say, "Oh, downloaders, they're all like this," because you can't say that either. Because a third of them in the UK or in my county are children, under 18 these days, which is another issue. Well, it's very relevant for this conversation, I guess. So it was kind of all that, and I over time began to take the view that part of the problem for these men and their criminality and their exploitativeness was, for many of them, not all, but for many of them, was also their relationship with pornography and legal, I'll say legal mainstream pornography, and how it had influenced them, sometimes unconsciously, because very, very few of the men I dealt with had any insight, and almost none of them have read any textbooks, which is a bit of a trite thing to say, but you would sort of offer them a bit of theory and they would say, "No, I've never heard of that. Oh, I didn't know that was a thing." You'd sort of describe psychological phenomena in the interview and say, "Have you heard of this phenomena? How it affects people sometimes?" "No, I've never heard of it." And they seemed to feel that they were just kind of drifting along and looking at things, and the things they looked at weren't influencing them, and the state of mind they were in wasn't relevant, and so forth. And I just felt that it was. And once you would set out something to them, you would kind of get this kind of rather unconscious nodding. You would be explaining some phenomena and they'd be kind of, and you would think, "Yeah, he gets this." Sometimes they would be absolutely clueless and you were barking up the wrong tree. But a lot of the time they were recognizing a description of certain behaviors that, for me, had become commonplace because they each had their unique experience. Whereas I'd had probably 500 or 750 experiences, either of seeing people directly or running groups with them or supervising the work of others and reading the paperwork. So I had this enormous library, really, panoply, histories of individuals, and you could sort of see the commonalities between their behaviour and their ideology, which is an interesting word when we talk about sexual deviance and pornography and so on. But I felt at one level that there was almost a coherent ideology about the nature of children and the nature of intimacy and sex and women and men and identity that was all in there, but very few of them had really given it any thought. So that's kind of where that, I suppose, the interview with the woman from The Guardian, I'd known her for a while. She'd always been on the fringes of my kind of eye line as someone who was interested in this subject, and I think we exchanged some words on X or something. And then she said, "Oh, I'd like to talk to you about your experiences." And she spoke to me about, I don't know, 3 years ago, and then again last year, because there've been some notorious cases in the UK where pornography has loomed large, or it's become an issue of concern for government or regulation. And so I think the time is long overdue for a sort of conversation about, well, what is pornography these days? in the online world, and how does it compare to pornography in the pre-internet era, which I personally experienced, and fewer and fewer people, because we're all dying, fewer and fewer people of a younger age know what I'm talking about, and the men, most of the men I would deal with, wouldn't know. Hello, boys and girls. At one time, nobody had a mobile phone. There wasn't such a thing. And at one time, there was no internet. Imagine that. And also, there's huge barriers in the 1970s and 80s to the consumption of pornography, and the absolute removal of barriers to the consumption of pornography from, I don't know, the mid to late 90s. From something that was difficult to get hold of, expensive, and sort of connected with, I suppose, shame and embarrassment and deviance at some level, to something that was absolutely and utterly mainstream and trendy and, funky and fun and commercial and ubiquitous. And that shift happened very quickly, but also without anybody really noticing. And in a rather pompous way, with nobody giving anybody permission to do it. We didn't say, shall we allow this then? What do you reckon, everybody? And everybody would go, oh, I don't know, let's have a look. It just happened. And then people had to adjust to it, rejoiced in it, felt appalled by it, whatever. But there was no, the world court, which doesn't exist, didn't decide to say, yes, let's have this, and let's see what happens, And and in terms of children, I mean, I've said from platforms, this is a joke. I tried to get funding to do an experiment where I would allow a group of 12-year-olds under my supervision to watch hardcore pornography, and I would not allow another group of 12-year-olds to watch hardcore pornography. And over time, we'd see how it worked out. And of course, if you offered that to any university, I would imagine, as an ethical, when it went before the ethics committee, they'd say, A, no, and B, we're calling the police and we're going to arrest you. Because the idea of allowing 12-year-olds to watch any pornography, really, hardcore pornography, whatever, is so outrageous that nobody would allow it. Yet we have allowed it, but nobody said, okay then. And it remains on the statute book in the UK, I'm sure where you are, that to facilitate children's viewing of pornography is a crime. So if I grabbed some children from over the road and said, come on to my house, kids, come and watch this pornography, I would be arrested, and I would deserve it. I would deserve to go to jail. I haven't done that. But corporations at one level seem to allow, inverted commas, children to view their product, or at least they don't take significant steps to prevent children from viewing their product, save ticking the box to say that you're 18. That's what you do in the UK. Are you 18? Yes. Yes. and you're in. And you're watching whatever they serve up for you, and I think that's problematic. And it's beginning to work its way through the system in a way, one in terms of very young men who are coming to the attention of the authorities having viewed child abuse material, and children viewing child abuse material, and children processed by the police and the courts for engaging in illegal sexual behaviours, misconduct and worse, and saying and citing the influences upon them, have absolutely included their viewing legal, mainstream pornography and aping the behaviours. They've seen it, so they want to do it, or they've been influenced by the ideology, and they begin to think that way. We're talking mostly here about male persons and the way that girls accommodate, which is a horrible word, but are having to manage or attempt to manage the behaviour of boys, and when they're women, men, in terms of their sexual behaviours, some of which have been influenced by like pornographic tropes and
Yeah,
stereotypes.
yeah. I think those influences are very strong. It was the late 90s, and I was studying, and I did some postdoctoral work around the narratives in online porn.
Right.
And at that time, I watched a lot, and a lot. I was expecting a knock at my door at one point.
I'm a
It was,
researcher.
yeah, I know, right? But it felt really weird. I spent 18 months surfing porn, and I never stumbled into child pornography at that time. It was
Right.
still a new world, and I was deeply concerned with what I was seeing, the aggressive and violent kind of nature of what was being played out, and definitely themes of teenagers and incest were there. But it seems that the doors have opened in a way that wasn't true back then, that is different now. The material that's out there and available is extraordinarily different and has gone into that space
Yeah.
of truly underage, illegal, and freely and easily available, and you can stumble into it by accident. And I think that's the difference. You can get taken on that journey, whereas I didn't go deliberately looking, but I
Right.
didn't ever stumble into it.
Yeah.
So,
No, you're right.
but nobody wanted to know about doing the research. I was trying to get research funding at the time to say, hey, we need to be talking about this and what it's going to do. And it was completely no.
Was that
Yeah,
late
we're not.
90s? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was this. There was always this idea. There was crossing the line. As if there are these two absolutely distinct subsets of pornography. One is legal and overage, if you like, and the other is child abuse material. And you have to make a significant step to get from one to the other. You can't stumble upon it. You must have an inbuilt notion of paedophilia or ambition to molest, and so on. Now, that's true for some of the men I deal with. Some of the men I've dealt with are, horrible terms, proper old school paedophilic child molesters, who I knew in the late 80s. They're exactly the same sort of person. But a lot of the men just weren't. They didn't have that history and that personality and even the ideas of these men. And there's this horrible blurry distinction, and you can stay on the right side, if you like, of the law, and yet still be exposed to what I think is highly dubious content.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, as an experiment for our viewers, I went on a very legal site about an hour and a half ago. It said,
yes.
Are you 18? And I went, yeah, I'm 18. And I wrote down the first 6 things that were offered to me. So I shall read them out, shall I? The first one was
Okay.
WTF, which we all know what that means. WTF, stepsister, you really grew up.
Right.
Okay, right. This one sounds very strange. Gorgeous brunette gets effed after she cheated on her boyfriend.
Right.
Sort of
So,
revenge notion there. I'm assuming it's revenge. Going
sounds like-
pantyless. Yeah, that's weird. Going pantyless in front of my stepbrother.
right.
Okay. This one starts out reasonable and then gets weird. Slow, sweet, teen, cream pie.
Yeah.
Accidentally come in my stepsister's pussy. And finally, truth or dare with stepmom. That's the first 6.
Yeah,
I didn't
and that-
search. I didn't put a search term in like weird stuff, please. I just went and saw what did the machine offer me. Now, if I were 13 or 14, having ticked I am 18, and I arrive here and I have relatively no sexual experience, and my template, my frame of reference for sex is pretty blank. What am I to make of all that?
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
and it shows.
I absolutely think it does. And if I'm an adult man and I'm just looking for entertainment, and four of the 6 are about incest or quasi incest. One of them's a sort of strange revenge fantasy, I'm assuming. and the other one is about teens, sexy teens. It's all rather peculiar and mainstream. And if I watched any of those, I would be on the right side of the law. But is that okay? Is that kind of? I don't know.
I think you and I would argue it's not, but it seems that we're not having robust enough conversations around the way we are shaped in and through the stories that we experience in our cultures. And your work your interest been very much around stories. So many questions to ask you, not enough time. But you mentioned that you felt like there was a sort of a shape of a story emerging from all of the people you work with, and your understanding of what's going on, even though you've got very diverse people and different communities you're dealing with. Can you unpack that, the shape of what you see happening in there? What's your experience tell you?
Yeah, well, because I would always start with a life story, because people expect you to immediately start on about their sexual deviance or their crime or whatever. And I would say, tell me about growing up, tell me about your mum and dad, and then we would say, tell me about where you learned about sex, and so on and so on. Now, the early men, will say, who were always involved in direct sexual offending against children, okay, their story would be of dysfunction and violence and abuse to themselves and negative influences and so on. So they had a pretty horrible time. Not to say, oh, that makes it okay, because it doesn't. But their life stories were very torrid and traumatic and full of horror. The later men, who most of them, their stories were rather mundane. It was just ordinary growing up, mum and dad or not mum, whatever, and they didn't have any particular trauma. Nothing terrible really happened to them. But then you would get to conversation about where did they learn about sex. And the younger they were, and by younger, I mean in their 20s and 30s, and really, I think the delineation, that the point of interest would be, was their adolescence pre or post internet?
Yeah.
And it's almost an anthropological argument now, post internet man. Because if it was post internet, their education about sex was most likely to have been pornographic. Whereas if it was pre-internet, their education about sex would be at school and also with another human being. And the issue then is about impediments, and guidance and mutuality, because an adolescence pre-internet and the sexual emergence was most likely to be with another human being who might like you, or think you were okay, or there'd be a bit of romance or a bit of fun, but there'd also be a bit of sort of resistance and courtship. A word that's not, I'm trying to bring back into the nation's conversation, because my mother would say, oh, are you courting? And courtship, and later studying courtship disorder, you realise that actually courtship's quite a skill, a human skill around empathy and engagement and fun and communication, But the post-internet men that I dealt with, and this is a select population, obviously, so my worldview is skewed, because men I've dealt with have all committed crimes. So maybe my worldview is distorted. But the ones I dealt with would describe, unfettered engagement with pornography, learning things that aren't true, having a sense of entitlement, really, to sexual relief and engagement that could always be met because the internet never closes.
Right.
And the good old, it was Al Cooper, the AAA engine. That was about 99. Affordability, accessibility, anonymity. There you are. Quiz question. The three drivers of internet legal pornography, and he was spot on. And he didn't know. I think he passed on. I know he didn't know how spot on he was. I think really, because he was saying, anonymity removes embarrassment, shame, inhibition. I think it does. So people were engaging with this stuff anonymously. Availability, pre-internet pornography was incredibly expensive. You know, I remember DVDs. Remember those, boys and girls, and videotapes that were in the UK £10. Now that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money. So you would have one videotape that's £10. Now you've got access to 1 million, 2 million videotapes for nothing. And you can, if you buy a videotape, you're invested in it. You've got to watch the whole damn thing, I assume. But if you're just clicking between sites, you're not spending any money. Look at this, look at this, look at this. There's this kind of endless availability of stuff, and the affordability, because it's nothing. So from really, really expensive to nothing, from hard to find to ubiquitous, from a bit embarrassing and inhibiting and whatever, shameful maybe, I don't know, to absolutely nobody knows I'm doing this. I shall do what I want. So the later men, and as time passed, of course, they became more common. This man became more common because the generations were growing up as I was continuing in my glorious career. And they would describe this process of just basically watching whatever they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, and how it began to influence them and what they used it for. That became interesting because I began to ask questions based on a few engagements. So I would deliberately ask about this. And it wasn't necessarily what you'd think. You know, it wasn't sort of, for some, yes, it was masturbation fodder. But for others, it was sort of a way of managing bad mood or sadness or depression or loneliness or anxiety or impotence, you know. And there's almost a dialectic, you know. I felt sad, I watched pornography, I felt cheerful, you know. I felt impotent, I watched pornography, I felt powerful, and so non-sexual problems they had were resolved sexually, and then there became a bit of a cyclical pattern to it. And of course, they became influenced by forces that they did not understand, you know, around, you know, the impact of arousal on decision making, impetuous behaviour, reduction in empathy, almost greediness, you know, failure to defer gratification, wanting it now, all that. And then issues around avoiding ennui, you know, I've seen that, and there's what else have you got? Coolidge effect, they sometimes call it, you know, that search for novelty. And if you want novelty, matey, we've got novelty. So but I would say, do you know anything about the Coolidge effect? No. Well, I'll tell you about the Coolidge effect, and then you would tell them about the Coolidge effect, little TED talk, 5 minutes, and they go, oh my god, yeah. Most of them would say that. Some of them would go, I don't know what you're talking about. Fine. But many of them go, oh, God, yeah, because I'd seen that, and then I wanted something else. What else have you got? And unbeknownst to them, of course, the mainstream offering is shaped by the algorithm, and the mainstream pornographers employ psychologists far more qualified than anyone I know, and far higher paid than anyone I know, who absolutely understand how this stuff works and how to maintain the customer's engagement, how to let them watch for longer, for more stuff, to try and get them to pay for something and so on. They understand how all this stuff works, whereas your consumer doesn't. Just as your naive gambler doesn't understand how my dad would say, you never see a poor bookie. You never see a poor bookie, because the bookmaker understands how this works, and you'll always lose eventually. So they don't understand how any of this stuff's happening. So they're trying to manage their mood. They've been educated to think that pornography is a solution to all sorts of things. Their life enters some sort of crisis that's not necessarily sexual. It might be just work related, or they're getting bullied at work, or their marriage is on the rocks, or their children and disrespecting them, or life's a disappointment, or whatever, and they revert. They remember, where were they happy in their adolescence? On the porn sites. So they go on the porn sites. But you get all you. I struggle with addiction arguments, frankly, but if you kind of look at the notions of what they're describing, like needing more of the stuff to be in the same place, thinking about it when you're not doing it, it beginning to impact on your day-to-day life, then many of those things are present. And then this kind of gradual watching for longer, watching more extreme stuff, watching stuff that actually makes them feel unhappy, which is one of the
That's
ironies. You know, what do they call it? Ego dystonic. It's a fancy word for that. You know, they're watching it in a state of arousal, but also feeling disgusted with themselves, you know, at the same time. And I says, what were your thoughts then? And it was, oh, this is really interesting. This is exciting. I'm a terrible person. I hate myself. I must stop. Oh, what else have you got? So it's all these kind of contradictory forces. And then they click off the site and they feel, some of them feel ashamed, embarrassed, sick, nauseated by themselves, full of self-hatred and regret and fear and shame, and they have to put it away because they have to emerge from their office or their bedroom, or some of them ended up in the toilets at work, you know, with a mobile phone. They'd pop to the toilet and just get a fix on their phone. I mean, that's, regardless of everything else, that's tragic in itself. And they would emerge and just have to, you know, put the kids to bed, or take the dog for a walk, or carry on doing the accounts, or fly a plane. You know, I had all these different men who would be in occupations, you know, surgeon, my God, pediatrician, all sorts of men. You think he really shouldn't be looking at that and then dealing with children in a surgical way, should he? And he was. And so that kind of ambivalence and horror and compulsion, I would say, with a small c, and self-hatred was so very common. And you know, they'd already crossed the line anyway, and sooner or later they get the knock on the door, at which time they may still be actively viewing, or some of them, and it was shown forensically, had stopped watching 2 years ago, but they've left a digital fingerprint as big as a footprint, you know, and it just takes a while for the police to get round to them. And in the end, they knock on the door and, hello, officer, I thought you would come in the end, is the usual story. And then dealing with all that, and their partners dealing with all that, and their children having to deal with all that. You know, your dad's done this, I saw him in the paper, your dad's a pedo, blah, blah, blah. And how do women, you know, the rock and the hard place for women in that situation as to, well, do you stand by your man, or do you kind of divorce him, and do you never let him see the kids? Do you let him see the kids? What do local authority children's services want you to do? What do the neighbours think? What does your mother think? There's just this horrific position women are in, and the horrific position men are in. And at one point in the UK, we had a suicide rate of about 4% through shame. You know, they were killed by shame. We're doing better now because we've put in services for men in this situation, you know, counselling, intervention, education, and also support for, at some level, support for families. So it's not a trivial, certainly it's not a trivial crime by any stretch of the imagination. And also the consequences are not trivial either, you know. And I say to men, there was a very, very early UK sentencing guideline, something like viewers of child abuse material are complicit in the original abuse of the child. And I absolutely believe that, you know, got dirty hands, complicit, and how can we help you?
There was a line you wrote around that, which is, we need to take responsibility for people we may never meet.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Quick story. I was talking to a man from a Midlands town who you wouldn't be able to understand because of his accent. So I will use his words. He wasn't getting what he was looking at. I said, "Look, do you understand how this stuff gets made?" And he said, "Well, yeah, it's kids getting abused, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it's children getting abused and filmed, and then you're watching it. Okay, yes." So, well, imagine you were in your house and you were looking out of your window into your back garden, and you looked down into the garden, and your next door neighbour was there, and he was sexually abusing a child. I said, would you like run next door and beat him up or something? Would you call the police? Or would you open the window and shout at him? Or would you film it? Bit provocative. And he says, I don't know the people next door. And I thought, well, that's really quite an eloquent answer, actually, because the men viewing the images, I don't know the children. And there's that kind of distancing from real world children, because, from a UK perspective, many of these children are foreign children. They look foreign. So maybe they're a bit different to children I know. Because you ask the man, what would you do if you found images of your child while you were on the site? They would usually go, well, I would find out who took those pictures and I would kill him. So they have kind of rage for men who molest their children, metaphorically, but confusion and disinterest and, not contempt. Well, some of them have contempt, but this kind of it's a lack of empathy, isn't it? It's just absence of empathy.
There's a huge dissociation that happens.
Yeah.
It's the same in child poverty, in war,
Yes.
people in other situations, and the distance is so great, it just feels too abstract to think.
I don't know these kids, therefore it's not really my problem. The other thing, which is worse than that I have come across, is almost a sense of like Schadenfreude, almost sadism. Like they absolutely know the children are suffering, and they're kind of enjoying that. This is a minority, but some of them, and I thought, it's not just that you weren't interested; it's that it was interesting to you that the child was exhibiting distress, or that you knew in your heart that the child didn't want this to happen. Some of the old school paedophiles would in their heart genuinely believe that that children enjoy sex with adults and it's all wonderful, hearts and flowers, consensual, skipping down the beach, holding hands, all that sort of stuff. Those men still exist, but the majority were either rather indifferent, as long as it was entertaining, or they were kind of bordering on sadism, that they were fully aware of the horrors that were inflicted upon children, and that was part of it, and that was part of the taboo, and that was part of sort of sticking it to society in a way. The monkey torture sites, my God, people pay to see children being molested. People pay to watch monkeys be tortured. That is beyond anything. Well, child molestation is beyond what I can imagine, but monkey torture and generic sadism sites are also, they're really out there. And yet one imagines most of these men, whatever they're looking at, then emerge from that and just attempt to carry on their daily duties, whatever it is they do. So it's that kind of, and I used to talk about the online world and the offline world, but now I don't do that, because you're never really offline, are you? Well, most people are genuinely not offline at all, because their phone's always pinging, and the differentiation between online offline is distinct. Whereas before, men would talk about turning on the PC. Remember that? Big cabinet PC and the boot up noise, we are, beep, 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 beep. And they would say the visceral excitement they would get through the booting up was there for them, and that's like cocaine addicts, isn't it? Once they've called the dealer, they're already into it, and gamblers heading for the bookmakers, they're already experiencing it. Whereas now, you don't need that wait at all. It's just instantly available to you. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, smartphone. Here we are. So that's changed. That spontaneity and endless availability of the substance, in your eyesight, it must have phenomenal effects upon people.
That transition that you described from, once upon a time, hearts and flowers down the beach, to violent, sadistic enjoyment from seeing suffering, was described to me by someone I was interviewing for the research who worked in customs, who had to view material And they said there was just a radical shift that took place
Yeah.
in that pre and post internet world. And
Yeah.
it was once upon a time happy, smiling, in inverted commas, complicit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Blonde, beautiful children, and then suddenly this physically violent, abused, beaten, and really distressed. In this world that you've been working in, have you kept your distance? Have you kept it together when you're confronted with such a lot?
I used a psychological trick that I invented for myself. Not that I recommend it for anybody else. When I was interviewing somebody, I used to pretend that none of this was really happening and that I was an actor in a TV film about someone doing my job, and this person I'm seeing was an actor acting the part of the person I was seeing. So none of it had actually happened. So we were all just in a play, and I was being a version of me, and he was being a version of someone I was interviewing. So there was that. Seeing child abuse material happen later on, and I've worked with police and customs. God bless New Zealand customs. I must say I've met a few of them. And we used to talk about how we manage this stuff, and my main one, it's rather mundane, was just trying to have a hinterland. You know, what else have you got? You know, and mine is planting hedges. My garden has far too many bushes and trees in it, and ponds. I would dig ponds because it's just the sheer physicality of the labour of moving soil around. You can't think about much else. And playing Tetris after you've viewed material, top tip. You know, just something to keep your mind off it, because it's researched. It's not rubbish. It's researched as a kind of prophylactic against trauma. You know, because it's so busily audiovisual, you can't lay down traumatic memory. So there's a couple of formal things one does, but there's also this thing of get yourself a hinterland. It doesn't matter what it is. Cycling has been one. Because cycling in the UK is so dangerous. You absolutely have to be completely switched on, and you can't think about anything else. So there's cycling. I know in Australia they get attacked by crows, don't they? I've seen that. That's quite strange. Crows attack your head as you're going along. That keeps your mind on the job. So that kind of notion, but also just saying, having friends and people, colleagues you trust, and just making it explicit that this is a really horrible job. But also, and this is really sort of Walt Disney and trite actually, but never mind, the sense that by what you're doing you are helping somebody, you know, that to do this protects an unknown future child, because whatever I've achieved, whatever that is, through my occupation, I'll never meet anybody that hasn't been molested as a result of anything I've ever done. But I have faith that somewhere out there that will have happened. So the sense that's the point. The biggest disappointment for me has been institutions. You know, I can sort of forgive each individual offending man because they're all individually flawed. You know, and I think, you know, and I might hate some of them, but they pass on, and I move on from them. But institutional failure, you know, and like corporations, and I just, you know, I wanted to stick it to the man. If only I could find out who the man was, you know, just this kind of vague fury at the authorities for, and you know, managers of sites and corporates who fail to deal with it, and governments that just look the other way, and regulators who are cowardly. All that I struggle with. But the images, that it's difficult. I work with a lot of police officers, you know, who each of whom has a very difficult memory of sights, and worse, they say sounds. I mean, I've heard sounds. Sounds are particularly fraught, I would say, in terms of what children are saying. and expressing when they're being sexually abused. It's hard to get over, you know. Yeah. I wrote a book. I wrote a book about it. Can I? I mean, I did write. The last thing I did in the
I was going to ask
foundation
about
was.
your book. Yeah.
Well, I sort of I entered I by mistake I entered a play competition because it just appeared in my Facebook feed. Oh, I'll do that then. So I wrote a monologue about a woman who was married to a downloader, and blow me down, it won. I had no expectations of it, so the damn thing won. So it had to be performed. That was the deal. So it got performed, and I saw it performed, and I thought, this is a way of showing people what this subject is about, because I delivered PowerPoint, you know, for years. Me banging on. You imagine me banging on in front of PowerPoint in various church halls and police stations about this subject, and 6 hours of that, and at the end of it someone puts their hands up and says, well, why do the men do this? And I thought, that's what I spent all day doing. You weren't paying attention. So I thought, well, try and get people here. So I kind of expanded that. So I ended up writing sort of 5 monologues about this subject with the downloader, the downloader's wife, the downloader's daughter, the police officer who arrests him, and a woman whose child's been filmed for molestation purposes, for child abuse material. Put them together with explanatory notes, as it rather grandiosely says, and called it Crossing the Line, because I'd heard that phrase so many times. So it's available in no good bookshops because it doesn't travel. But I'll send you a copy if you like. And it's available actually from Amazon, but I'm trying to boycott Amazon.
I was going to say, oh God. Well, yes, but your book's so worthwhile, and the profits all go to support children with parents in prison. So
yeah, that was the idea. Yeah, because I didn't want any money out. I felt a bit weird having money out of it.
And this is, I think, Amazon UK to buy the book, people, is a really good idea, definitely.
Or direct from the publishers, which is available on the website, who are lovely people who are down the road. And more money goes to the charity if you do that, because Amazon keeps some of it.
They do indeed.
Spend on sweets or something. I don't know what they do with all their money. There you go.
Who is your publisher for people to look up?
Aspect Design. ASPECT, Aspect Design. It's in Malvern in the UK, but they do post it. They've posted it to various places. Every now and again they send me a sort of bill and say, we need to publish more books, but here's your commission. We sent one to Azerbaijan or something, and I go, oh really? It was kind of, the joke was, it was sort of it took 6-7 years to write the thing because I did it in episodes. So the strapline should be 7 years to write, 35 years to research, which essentially it was, because it was a sort of retirement project, but just pre-retirement I wrote it. I thought, here is a semicolon on my career, which is, the book basically describes what I did for 25 and a half years, and that's what I was doing. Because a lot of people down the pub here would say, what is your job? And I'll go, sort of like social work. And they go, yeah, but what sort of social work? You go, well, sort of like working with sort of child protection. Yeah, but exactly what? And in the end, they go, I interview men who've molested children. Then they go, oh, right. And that was the end of that. So I thought, for the lay person or the interested reader, here's what the job is. And the nicest thing that was ever said was the detective sergeant in West Mercia, where I live, said, I give this book to new recruits, to the team, to the paedophile online team, say, do you want to know what the job is? This is what the job is. You may read this book and then decide you don't want to do it, or that it's the best thing you could ever possibly do. So that was the nicest thing anyone ever said to me. Probably.
I think it's well deserved. I think also, like, who might interested parties be? Because this is very specific and difficult work. But for me, the place where we come together really strongly is in the need for sex education that isn't pornography.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. And any parent listening, should be thinking about how they get involved in educating their kids about sex, sexuality, sexual identity in really healthy ways, so that when they hit pornography, which they will,
Yeah.
they come at it with a framework that pre-exists that and somewhere to ground themselves, right?
Absolutely, because pornography will fill the void that parents leave. No question. And it's always available to children, whereas your mum and dad might not be. It's hugely influential upon this notion of sexual scripts, erotic template, whatever the case may be.
And so, I mean, you're an extraordinary human. You've done incredible work. You've, like, the writing of the book, the play, the storytelling. I feel like, what next for you? Because it feels like you've got so much in there. Are you going to be just in that garden?
A heron's ate all my fish about 3 months ago, so I'm having to find some more fish. So that's a priority. And the hedge needs trimming. I'm still doing some work. I still work for the English Football Association as a sort of like quasi-judicial person, banning people from being involved in football. I do some lecturing at a number of universities. I'm still on the Europol course, which is 2 weeks a year, which is sort of 12 extraordinarily dedicated professional nerds and me, all the police officers. They all do the techie side, I do the human side, and we spend 12 days, 13 days teaching about 40 to 50 police officers from all over. We've had some Kiwis on it historically, Americans, Australians, but every country in Europe's allowed to send two police officers or prosecutors. So I'm still doing that, and I'm still working with some organisations, charities that are dealing with what they call the knock here. So when the police come to your door, it tends to be the knock, and the fallout from that. And I've written some new monologues really that to be interspersed into their training to deal with the things that they deal with.
Michael, I could have spent many hours more with you. Just the most enormous pleasure to talk with somebody who cares deeply, who knows so much, and who's just clearly such a lovely human.
You're very kind, thank you.